I did not lose a decade to addiction. I did not lose it to war, to prison, or to some great disaster that made for an easy explanation. I lost 10 years of my life to a spreadsheet. My parents' spreadsheet. That might sound small, but stay with me. Because by the time I understood what had happened, I was 31 years old. I had a perfect resume, a clean credit score, and a soul that felt completely, utterly empty. I remember the exact moment I realized it. I was sitting in my car in a parking garage after work, staring at the concrete wall in front of me. The engine was off. The radio was off. I had been sitting there for 40 minutes without noticing. I was not crying. I was not angry. I was just absent. Like someone had scooped the inside of me out and left the shell behind, polished and presentable. I was wearing a pressed shirt and good shoes, and I had no idea who I was or what I actually wanted. That was the day it started to crack. Not dramatically. Just a small, quiet fracture. The kind you do not notice until the whole thing gives way. This is the story of how I got there, and how I slowly, painfully, found my way back. My name is Owen, and I grew up in a house where love was not free. My parents, Ray and Claudette, were not cruel. They were organized and deliberate. They had a plan, and that plan included me in very specific ways. My father was an engineer who kept a color-coded planner on his desk at all times. My mother had worked in administration for 15 years and believed deeply in structure. Together, they approached parenting the way some people approach building a house. You draw up the blueprint first. You do not leave things to chance. From the time I was about 7, I understood without anyone saying it plainly that certain choices were already made. The school I would attend. The friends they approved of. The activities after school. Chess club, yes. Art class, maybe, if it did not interfere with math tutoring. Nothing was said with cruelty. Everything was said with certainty. And because I was a child and because their certainty felt like safety, I accepted it. I followed the map they laid down. I followed it for a very long time before I ever stopped to wonder whether it was leading somewhere I actually wanted to go. That question, when it finally arrived, changed absolutely everything about my life. In my house, love had a currency. That was the clearest way I could describe it. Good grades bought warmth. A strong report card meant my father would ruffle my hair at dinner, and my mother would make my favorite meal on a Friday. A disappointing grade meant cool silence. Not shouting. Not punishment in any traditional sense. Just an emotional withdrawal that hung over the house like fog. I learned quickly that compliance bought peace. If I chose the extracurricular they suggested, the weekend was pleasant. If I pushed back, the air shifted. My mother would get a tired, faintly disappointed look. My father would say, measured and calm, "We just want what's best for you, Owen." I believed him. I was a child. Children believe that. The problem was that what was best for me and what fit their plan were always exactly the same thing in their version of events. There was never a conversation that began with "What do you want?" There were conversations that began with "Here is what we've decided," and then they waited for me to agree. So I stopped questioning. Not all at once. Just gradually, quietly, I folded myself into the shape they needed. And the folding became so natural that I forgot I had ever had another shape at all. By high school, I had become very good at being their version of me. I was on the honor roll. I was in debate club because my father said it built discipline. I played piano because my mother considered it a mark of a well-rounded person. I had friends, but they were the surface-level kind made when you have very little free time and even less freedom. Polite connections where you sit together at lunch but never say anything true to each other. I did not go to the parties other kids talked about on Monday mornings. I was not interested in breaking rules, partly because I was focused, but mostly because I had been trained to see stepping outside the approved path as genuinely dangerous. In our house, that did not result in a conversation. It resulted in the fog. And I would do almost anything to avoid the fog. What I did not understand then was how much of myself I was leaving behind in the process. I thought I was being a good son. I thought the mild, constant discomfort I carried was just the price of growing up, the thing everyone felt but nobody spoke about. It did not occur to me yet that most people were not this quiet inside. That most people had actual opinions about their own lives and felt entitled to act on them freely. When it came time to choose a university, I was 17 and the decision was handled the way most decisions were in our house. My parents researched the options, made a short list, and presented it over dinner with a printed summary for each school, including rankings, employment rates, and average starting salaries by major. I sat across the table and read through the papers like I was reviewing a work assignment. For a brief moment, I noticed that one school had a strong film studies program. Something flickered inside me. I had always been quietly drawn to storytelling, to how films could make you feel things that were hard to name otherwise. But I looked at my father's face and then at the summary sheet, and film studies was not on the list of approved majors. Business was. Engineering was. Law was. I said nothing about the film program. I pointed to the business school at the top of their list, and my father nodded slowly and said, "Good choice, Owen. Solid." My mother smiled and said they were proud. Something in me smiled back and went very still. I enrolled that autumn in a business program 3 hours from home. I told myself I was excited. I almost believed it. That small flicker of genuine want went back underground without a fight. University should have been where I expanded. For about 3 weeks at the start, something different began. I was away from home, away from the planner and my mother's watchful silences. I stayed up late with people on my hall, talking about things that had nothing to do with grades. I went to a poetry reading on a Wednesday night because someone invited me and I said yes before thinking. I sat in the back of a dark room and listened to a woman read about her grandmother and felt my eyes go hot in a way I could not fully explain. But then the first assignment grades came back, and I called home on Sunday like always. My father asked about my study schedule. My mother asked whether I had connected with the faculty advisor yet. Just like that, the window closed. I went back to the map. I joined the Business Students Association. I made friends who talked about internships and networking opportunities. I stopped going to things that did not fit the plan. The girl who ran the poetry readings smiled at me once in a hallway a few weeks later. I looked away and kept walking. I was back in formation, obedient and efficient, performing the role that had been written for me before I ever had any say in my own life. I graduated at 22 with a business degree and a job offer from a mid-sized financial consulting firm my father had located through his professional network. My parents drove out to celebrate. My mother brought a cake with my name on it. My father shook my hand firmly and said, "This is it, Owen. This is what all the work was for." I stood holding the offer letter and wearing a smile I had practiced my whole life. I was 22. I had a degree I had not chosen, a job I had not found, and a future drawn up and handed to me like a completed form waiting for my signature. And I signed all of it. Every decision and direction. Signed with my continued silence and my practiced smile and my complete inability to imagine wanting anything different. Because by that point, I genuinely did not know what I wanted. The wanting had been so thoroughly replaced by performing that I had lost track of where one ended and the other began. I moved into a clean apartment in the city. I bought a work wardrobe. I became, on the outside, exactly what they had designed. And for a while, because the momentum carried me forward, I did not stop long enough to feel how hollow the entire structure actually was underneath the surface. The job was fine. That was the most honest word for it. Not terrible. Not joyful. Fine. I was good at it because I had been trained my whole life to be good at things I had not chosen. I met deadlines. I impressed senior colleagues. I received a commendation at the end of my first year that my mother framed and hung in their hallway. I attended client meetings, spoke clearly, and dressed well. Every evening I drove home to my clean apartment, ate dinner alone, and felt a quiet that was not peaceful. It was the quiet of a room with nothing in it. By 24, I had everything the blueprint had promised. The degree. The recommended job. The retirement savings account my father had helped me set up. The polished surface that said everything was going according to plan. But underneath all of it, something I had no language for was slowly corroding. On weekends, when I had no schedule to follow, I would stand in the middle of my apartment and not know what to do with myself. No hobbies I had chosen for myself. No music I had found on my own. No passions developed far enough to mean anything real. I was a very well-reviewed, entirely hollow person, and I had not yet admitted that even to myself. I started noticing things around that time that I had not let myself notice before. I would sit in meetings and wonder whether anyone else felt the way I did. A colleague named Patrick mentioned one afternoon that he had spent his 20s in a job he hated before quitting and spending a year traveling. He said it casually, like a funny story from his past. But I sat very still while he talked. Something in me leaned forward. I wanted to ask him everything. What did it feel like to leave? How did you know you were allowed to? I said nothing. I smiled and the moment passed. On the drive home that evening, I thought about Patrick's story the entire way. I thought about the year he had described, chosen and chaotic and entirely his, and I felt something rise in my chest I could not name. It was not envy exactly. It was closer to grief. Like mourning something I had never actually had. I turned the radio off and sat with that feeling until I pulled into my parking spot. Then it went back underground the way everything did. The way I had been trained to let it go. But it left a mark this time. A quiet, insistent mark that did not fully fade the way it usually did. By 26, I had developed a habit I was ashamed to admit even to myself. After work, I would sit in my car in the parking garage before going upstairs. Not for long at first. 10 minutes, maybe 15. I would sit in the quiet and decompress, or so I told myself. But as months went on, the time stretched. 20 minutes, 30, sometimes more. I was not doing anything. Not listening to music, not making calls, not reading. Just sitting in the dark of the garage, staring at the concrete wall, being nobody in particular for a little while. Not Owen the consultant, not Ray and Claudette's son, not the promising young professional with a clean credit score. Just a person in a car, anonymous and briefly free of the performance. I never told anyone about those sessions. I was too ashamed, and too aware that explaining them meant explaining everything else, and I was not ready. But I knew that those 30 minutes of staring at a wall were somehow the most honest part of my day. And that realization frightened me deeply. Because if the truest version of my life was happening in a parking garage in silence with no one watching, then what exactly was all the rest of it for? Had no answer. Not yet. I turned 29 in the spring. My parents drove into the city for dinner as they did every year. My father had recently framed a promotion letter I had received, a small step up in title and salary. He brought it in a cardboard tube and presented it over dessert. My mother looked at it and then at me and said warmly, "Look how far you've come, Owen." And I looked at the framed letter, at my father's satisfied expression, at my mother's proud smile. Something broke open very quietly inside me. Because I realized, sitting at that dinner table with a glass of wine I had barely touched, that I had never actually left the starting line. All of it, the degree, the job, the promotions, every achievement I had stacked up, had been built on a foundation someone else had poured. I had been running hard for 9 years in a direction I had never chosen. Everyone at the table was celebrating, and I was watching from very far away. Smiled. Said thank you. I hugged them both. I drove home alone and sat in the parking garage for a long time before I could make myself go upstairs. When I finally got inside, I lay down on the floor of my living room and stared at the ceiling in complete, absolute silence. That night on the floor changed something in me. Not because anything dramatic happened. Nothing did. I just lay there asking myself the same question, turning it slowly like a stone in water. If I died tomorrow, would I be mourning me or the character I had been playing for everyone else? I stayed with that until it stopped feeling abstract. The answer, when I let myself hear it clearly, was that I would be mourning the character. Because the actual person underneath had barely been allowed to show up. I did not know what music I genuinely loved. I did not know what I would do with a free year. I did not know what kind of life I would build if the blueprint had never existed. I was 29 years old and I did not know myself. I had been so busy being what others needed that I had never had time to find out who I actually was. I got up off the floor eventually. I brushed my teeth and went to bed. But I did not sleep. I lay in the dark thinking about the cost of everything I had agreed to, every version of myself I had quietly set aside to keep things smooth and easy. I was not fully angry yet, but something had shifted in a direction it would not be shifting back from. I started seeing a therapist a few weeks after my 29th birthday. Her name was Dr. Petra. She had a large window in her office and a plant I always noticed because it was slightly too big for its pot, roots pressing at the edges like they needed more room. I did not tell my parents I was going. That felt significant on its own because for most of my life they had known my full schedule. With Dr. Petra, I sat in a chair and talked about things I had never said out loud. The parking garage sessions. The feeling of watching my own life from the outside. The question I had asked myself on the floor. She listened without rushing me toward any conclusion. She asked real questions with actual weight. After our third session, I walked to my car and sat in the driver's seat for a few minutes. But this time the sitting felt different. It felt like the beginning of something rather than the exhausted end of a day. I did not know yet what I was going to do. But I knew I was finally, for the first time in a very long time, actually looking at my own life instead of living inside someone else's version of it. That distinction, small as it sounds, felt like everything to me. Therapy opened a door, and behind it was a decade of stored feeling. Anger came first, which surprised me. I had always thought of myself as someone who did not get angry. But Dr. Petra pointed out that unfelt anger does not disappear. Changes form. It becomes numbness or depression, or that hollow going through the motions I had mistaken for adult life. When I finally let myself feel the anger, it was not explosive. It was quiet and very deep, like heat trapped in the ground. I was angry at the years of following a map I had not drawn. I was angry at 17-year-old Owen at that dinner table, looking at the film studies brochure and saying nothing. I was angry at the version of me who had spent whole weekends in his apartment not knowing how to just exist without a task. But more than anyone else, I was angry at the years. At the irreversible fact of them. I could not go back to 22 and choose differently. What was done was done. Dr. Petra kept returning to the same point. The question was not what had been lost. The question was what was still possible. That was harder to face. It required hope, and I was not yet sure I had any left in me. The decision did not come all at once. It built up over months of therapy, of sitting with things I had been avoiding. By the time I turned 30, I had made up my mind about one thing. I could not keep living inside a structure built for someone else's comfort. I did not have a grand plan or a vision for what freedom would look like. I just knew I had to stop. Stop performing. Stop complying. Stop running along a track that was grinding me down to nothing. The practical decisions came slowly and each one felt enormous. I gave notice at the firm. Not on impulse. I had saved enough to live without the salary for a reasonable stretch, and I had thought through the numbers carefully, one of the few useful habits from my previous life. I signed the papers on a Tuesday morning and walked out into a cold, bright afternoon. I stood on the pavement and waited for relief or terror, or something dramatic to arrive. What I felt instead was very quiet. Like the moment after a long piece of music finally ends and the room is still adjusting. I stood there breathing for a minute. Then I walked to a coffee shop and ordered something I had never tried before, just to find out whether I liked it. Telling my parents was the hardest conversation of my life to that point. I drove to their house on a Saturday and sat at the same kitchen table where so many decisions had been handed to me over the years. I told them I had left the firm. My father went very still. My mother set down her cup carefully. They asked questions measured at first, then less so. My father said I was throwing away everything I had built. My mother asked if I was going through something, the way people ask when they cannot process that the answer might simply be, yes, and the thing I am going through is called waking up. I tried to explain honestly. I told them I was not well in a way that did not show on the outside, and that I needed to stop and find out who I was without the structure they had built around me. The fog settled over the table. My father stared at its surface for a long time. My mother's face did something complicated that I did not have a name for. I drove home that evening feeling scraped clean. Not empty in the old way. raw in a new one. Like something long covered was finally in the open air, tender and real and beginning, for the very first time, to breathe. The first months after leaving the job were deeply uncomfortable. Stories about people leaving hard situations often skip the part where the leaving itself is its own kind of hard. I moved from my expensive apartment into a small studio that cost half as much. I had a mattress on the floor for 3 weeks because I had given away most of my furniture and could not bring myself to replace everything yet. Things felt temporary in a way that was sometimes freeing and sometimes frightening depending on the hour. I lost friends during that period, or rather I understood that some of those connections were not real friendships. They were networking contacts dressed in casual clothes. People who knew successful Owen and found the quieter, figuring it out version confusing or inconvenient. Some stopped calling. The calls I had expected to miss turned out to be ones I barely noticed were gone. That was its own discovery. You learn quickly what you actually value when you strip away the context. You find out which connections were about your role and which were about the actual person underneath it all. I had fewer of the second kind than I had realized. That was painful. But it was also honest. And honest, I was learning, was something I could work with. I started doing things I had never been allowed to prioritize. Small things at first. I went to a film on a Tuesday afternoon because I had the time and I wanted to. I started cooking properly, not for any practical reason, just out of curiosity. I found I liked it, the slowness of it and the way it rewarded full attention. I read novels for the first time since secondary school, not business books, but actual stories about people living complicated, messy lives. I walked for long stretches without a destination, something my previous schedule had never allowed. I started writing in a plain notebook. Not journal entries exactly. Just thoughts, half-formed ideas, observations. I wrote about the parking garage sessions. I wrote about the poetry reading at university that I had quietly abandoned. I wrote about the film studies brochure and the 17-year-old who said nothing. I wrote without any goal, which meant for the first time in my life I was doing something entirely for myself, with no measurable outcome and no one to impress. It was uncomfortable and deeply satisfying in equal measure. I was not healed. I was not rebuilt. But I was beginning at 30 years old to find out what I was actually like when nobody at all was grading me. There was a moment, about 8 months after leaving the firm, that I have returned to many times since. I was sitting at the small table in my studio on a Sunday morning. The window was open, rain coming in slightly, and I was reading a novel with coffee I had made too strong by accident. And I realized I was completely at ease. Not happy in any grand sense. Not fixed or figured out. Just present. Just there, in that small room with the rain and the strong coffee and the book, without performing for anyone or moving toward any external goal. That ease was something I had not felt in so long that I had to pause and recognize it carefully, the way you handle something fragile. I thought about the parking garage sessions. I thought about the polished smiles and color-coded planners. I thought about what Dr. Petra had said once, that lost time is not wasted if it teaches you what you actually need to know. I was not certain I fully believed that yet. The cost of those years still sat in me as real and heavy. But in that moment, with rain on the window and nobody watching, I understood for the first time that I was capable of a life that was actually mine. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, everything. My relationship with my parents changed during that period in ways that were slow and complicated. There was no dramatic clearing of the air, no single conversation that resolved everything. It was more like a gradual renegotiation, uncomfortable for everyone involved. My father struggled most. He expressed love through provision and planning, and when I stepped away from the plan, he did not know how to reach me. There were long stretches of short phone calls where we talked around each other carefully. My mother was slightly more willing to try. She asked questions that surprised me sometimes, not the organized goal-oriented questions of my childhood, but actual questions about what I was finding out about myself. I answered honestly when I could and was patient when I could not manage that. I had come to understand through therapy that my parents were not villains. They were people who believed completely in a certain way of loving and had never thought to question it. That did not make the cost smaller. But it made it possible to sit across from them without performing happiness or making them into enemies. The relationship we were slowly building now was more honest than anything we had managed during my entire childhood. And that honesty, uncomfortable as it was, felt more real. At 31, I took a part-time role at a small production company that made short documentary content. It was not prestigious. The pay was a fraction of what I had earned at the firm. My father did not understand it, and I no longer needed him to. I found I was genuinely interested in the work, in how stories were shaped and what choices determined what a viewer felt. I was not brilliant at it immediately. There was a steep learning curve and I made mistakes I would not have made in the role I had been trained for. But the discomfort of learning something I had actually chosen felt entirely different from the discomfort of excelling at something I had not. I was still in therapy, though our sessions had grown less urgent and more reflective. Dr. Petra and I talked about what rebuilding looked like in practice. Not as a concept but as daily choices. Choosing to say what I actually thought in a meeting rather than what seemed safest. Telling a colleague honestly that I did not yet know how to do something rather than performing competence. Choosing repeatedly and intentionally to be a real person rather than a polished version of one. These were not enormous choices in themselves. But after a lifetime of going the other direction, each one felt worth marking. I want to be honest about something that took me a long time to say clearly. My parents loved me. Believe that fully. They loved me in the way they understood love, through security, structure, and certainty. They were not trying to hollow me out. They were trying to protect me from the disorder that had, in their own histories, cost people things they could not get back. I understood that better as I got older. But understanding the intention does not erase the impact. You can be loved in a way that still costs you something real. You can be given everything your parents believe is valuable and still end up in a parking garage at 29, staring at a wall, trying to remember who you are. Both things are true at once. Their love was genuine, and the form it took had been genuinely limiting. I held both of those truths at the same time and stopped trying to make one of them disappear. That was its own kind of growing up. The kind that does not come with a framed certificate or a proud handshake or a celebration dinner. It just comes quietly, over time, in the privacy of your own slowly recovering interior. Quietly, honestly, and without anyone's approval or permission. The 10 years between 21 and 31 were not wasted. I had to say that many times before I actually believed it. They were the years in which I became skilled at performance, at compliance, at the exhausting art of being what other people needed without asking anything for myself. Those skills were not useful in the life I was building. But they gave me something else. They gave me the absolute bone-deep knowledge of what it feels like to live without yourself. And once you know that feeling clearly, once you have sat in enough parking garages and smiled through enough celebrations that felt like they were happening to someone else, you cannot unknow it. It becomes a compass. Any time you start drifting back toward performing, toward living for an external grade rather than an internal truth, the old emptiness shows up. And now I recognized it instantly. Dr. Petra had said something I wrote down and returned to many times. She said the years I spent living someone else's life were the tuition I paid for understanding what my own needed to look like. I had paid steeply for that education. But I had it now. And I was not going to waste what remained by spending the next decade staring backward at the cost of the last one. 2 years after leaving the firm, I was still in the small studio, still in monthly therapy, still at the production company. I had started writing longer pieces, essays about growing up inside someone else's blueprint. I did not publish them immediately. I wrote them because the writing was helping me, organizing the years into something I could see clearly from the outside rather than feel from inside the middle of it. I was 32 when I read one of those essays back to myself late one quiet night. And I felt something I had not expected. Pride. Not the performed, external kind I had spent my whole life chasing. Quiet, private, interior pride. I had written something true. Something that had cost real effort to be honest about. And it belonged to me in a way that nothing in the previous decade had. The apartment, the job title, the promotion letter in the cardboard tube. None of it had ever truly been mine. But the words on those pages were. The hard-won clarity in them. The story of a person who had been thoroughly lost and was stubbornly, imperfectly finding his way back to himself. I closed the laptop and sat in the dark for a while, not blankly the way I used to in the parking garage, but quietly, in the way of someone who is finally, genuinely beginning to feel at home. If you have read this far, I want to say something directly. Not as a lesson, because I am not positioned to offer those. Just as something I know from living inside this experience. The cost of living someone else's life is real and high. And for a long time you may not even realize you are paying it. It comes off you gradually, in small daily amounts, so quietly that the loss is almost invisible until one day you are in a parking garage staring at a wall and cannot remember the last time you made a choice that was entirely your own. If that sounds familiar, here is what I want you to know. The years behind you are not the point. The question is what you do with the clarity now that you finally have it. I'm still working that out. I am 33 and I do not have a triumphant final chapter to hand you. What I have is this knowledge. Choosing yourself, even when it is late, even when it costs you things and people you love, even when nobody around you understands it, is not selfish. It is the most necessary thing you will ever do. The decade is gone and I am not getting it back. But the next one is entirely mine. And for the first time in longer than I can honestly remember, I am looking forward to every single day of it.